Hi. So I'm going to talk about games and documentary. I work as a journalist and as a fiction writer. I've just been working on screenplay as well, so film's been kind of just on the forefront of my mind quite a lot recently. I went up to the Sheffield Doc Fest recently, so I thought, oh, documentary, that's interesting, let's talk about that. Games and documentary. I'm just curious, do many of you watch documentaries? Are any of you like really avid documentary? Oh fuck, okay, that was I could have made anything up. When I was researching this, researching is probably an overstatement of the amount of work, but I was looking, I read this anecdote by a film professor, and he says he starts every kind of semester, he does this documentary making class. He asks his class, what is a documentary? Which is like, I guess, what all professors do at the start of every semester. And he'd say that most people in the class would respond along the lines of, it's filming reality. It's putting a camera and filming reality as reality is. And then he says, well, if say I were say I was an installer of CCTV cameras, I put them up, they film reality, am I a documentary filmmaker? And they'd be like, what? Like So I guess, I don't have an answer to what a documentary is. I guess you'd have to take that guy's class. But there is a distinction, I guess, between just filming reality and then presenting what I'd imagine to be a subjective view of reality. So I will get onto games in a bit, I promise. But I found this really good quote from Diego Vertov, who's a very, very early filmmaker. A lot of people kind of group him in as a kind of documentary filmmaker. I can't write. No, hold on. Is there a way to get rid of these notes? Oh, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I'll read it off here. So, I am an eye, a mechanical eye. I, the machine, show you a world the only way I can see it. I free myself for today and forever from human immobility. I'm in constant movement. I approach and pull away from objects. I creep under them. I move alongside a running horse's mouth. I fall and rise with the falling and rising bodies. This is I, the machine, maneuvering in the chaotic movements, recording one movement after another in the most complex combinations. Now, I really love this quote because I think it encapsulates in some way that joining between a kind of machine-like objectivity, which maybe those students in the class with the CCTV cameras kind of would assume documentary to be, and obviously this idea of heavily subjective view. So the idea that you are an I, so the director as an I. Now, those are just some random ideas, but how can we apply all this to games, and can games be documentaries? One possible game to maybe kind of throw in at this point is it's 1979 Revolution, or Revolution 1979, which is great, and it's very much in the kind of Telltale Games format, but it focuses on the Iranian Revolution, and you play a photographer, and you kind of start off at a distance just wanting to photograph this kind of building revolution, but then through the decisions you make, you inevitably get kind of brought into the narrative that's unfolding around you. Now, is this a documentary? It's based on a real situation, it's based on a real historical situation, but is it a documentary? Are you kind of projecting, are the developers showing reality, or are they showing a kind of fictional version of history? You'd probably say the latter. If I compare it to something like Human Acts by Han Kang, which is a book, it's a novel, it's a really brilliant novel. I could bring up like a multiplicity of different novels. This one's about the Korean student uprising in the kind of 1980s. You wouldn't say it's a documentary. You would say that it's a kind of fictional account of a real historical moment. So how could games, if they're going to tell a fictional story, how can they actually focus on telling a real story in a format kind of fitting a documentary? So I came across this quote from Ian Bogost. I don't actually know how to pronounce his name, like I've only ever seen it written down. Is it Bogost? Bogost. Yeah. I like Bogost. So he. So I guess this is kind of the main first point. I guess would be that he talks about them in terms of systems rather than specific accounts. So if we're going to think about maybe a documentary form for games, the idea in which you kind of think of it as a system rather than an individual account of maybe a historical moment. So he wrote he wrote a kind of non-fiction book about news games. So news games are when you kind of employ this form to looking at news. So he names a few different ones. The first is one from, I think Wired magazine did this. So it's looking at, like the Somalian kind of pirate. I mean, this was a few years ago, but when the kind of Somalian pirate problem issue was a big thing in the news, they created a game in which you play as a Somalian pirate captain, and you have to kind of hijack vessels and then negotiate to get a lot of money. The great thing about this game is that it's incredibly easy. So it's easy to get a lot of money, which in some ways it highlights this idea of the fact that you can go out and you can get like millions of dollars quite easily highlights the financial incentive of a pirate, that it kind of builds that, I don't know what I'm talking about, sorry. Anyway, so there's another one I saw which Mary Hamilton actually tweeted out today, which I would kind of class more as a kind of piece of satire, but some people might kind of classify it as a news game, where you have to basically, it kind of takes the model of those kind of sports games where you push two buttons really quickly, but the idea is you have to think and pray in a very quick succession, and then that actually has no effect, and you can't push this button. So I think this is actually more a piece of satire, but it shows how a game can interact with news and in some ways supplement it. I think in this case it's more a kind of satirical supplementation, but you can see how it could be extended to something a little bit larger. This game from this is Al Jazeera. Have made this game where this is actually the process of journalism. You start, it's kind of, you play it very much like a kind of scrolling text game where you have to make decisions as a journalist how you investigate, in this case, the Syrian electronic armies. And if you make decisions like trying to interview someone or trying to fly over to interview someone, it takes time, and then you have a limited amount of time, and then if your time runs out, like the project ends. So a lot of these things put kind of monetary and time constraints on your efforts to do something, whether it's being a Somalian pirate captain having to get loads of money, or a journalist trying to investigate Syrian electronic armies. But this is kind of, maybe you can see where the overlap with games and journalism can kind of come in. It doesn't replace journalism, but it supplements it. And the idea, I guess, is that having gone through the process yourself in some way through a game, that you have a level of empathy, or that you have a level of kind of understanding for maybe what's happening in the news, something that you can't get from maybe just watching a filmed account or reading about it in a story. But I guess that's quite different from documentary. So this is a good quote from Werner Herzog. You see too many documentaries where you have all this investigative reporting and finding out that he's a real bad guy. It's ad nauseum, it's just journalism. Documentary film must divorce itself from journalism. Most documentaries are an extension of journalism. It's legitimate, yes, do it and declare it journalism, but there's something else out there. So I guess if these games are news games, the ones I've just talked about there, how could you have a documentary game? So a documentary game, I guess, as opposed to maybe a specific news story, might look at the larger issues, not just in the moment, but like, for example, this one, which is Cart Life, which you play an immigrant coming to the US, and you have to make a series of decisions about, what you work as in this case, you work as a newspaper vendor, and you have to make a series of kind of financial decisions throughout the day. And again, I guess that the aim here is that there's a level of empathy that you get from having to make those decisions yourself. So if we're going back to Boo Ghost, his idea of the focus here is on the system rather than a specific account. So it's not a specific account of an individual's case of immigration or experience of immigration into the US, but it's looking at the kind of systemic issues around having to manage money or jobs not being available. Another maybe good one in this case is Spent, where if maybe the last one was looking at issues around immigration, this one's looking at issues of poverty. So again, I can't remember who made this game, but it's focused on kind of communicating an aspect of poverty, that you're given a certain budget and you have to make a lot of decisions, and in some ways the aim here is again to kind of go through that process of having to deal with very little money, and in some ways that would communicate something that maybe news stories or a traditional documentary about poverty in the US or the UK would be unable to do. But here, I mean, this is a good quote from Simon Parkin, who was writing in The Observer, where he says, this was about Spent. He says, a video game seems like an ideal way to explore the impossible choices with which one is faced while living in poverty. A study carried out by the Psychology Today, however, found that for many, playing the game had no effect on positive feelings towards the poor. In fact, the game had a negative effect on attitudes among certain participants, including some people who were sympathetic to the poor to begin with, states the article's author. Blame rests, she argues, with the game's mechanics, which leave players with the impression that people living in poverty are able to change their circumstances simply by challenging their choices. Yes, games can inform us, create empathy, and deepen our understanding of social systems. That same power also enables them to enforce problematic values in profound ways. This tool, whose power is only beginning to be explored, must be wielded with care. I think this is a really interesting point, that in some ways, if you're trying to think about it in terms of documentary, in terms of creating a platform to explore the systems that underline kind of social or political problems, creating it in terms of making it into a game leaves you with the chance to maybe win. And I guess it's interesting linking to what Rob was saying about the idea of not having a win state, or a lot of games not allowing you to win, or maybe the idea in which you create these problems and create a system in which you're able to solve it isn't an accurate reflection of reality. So in terms of documentary, is that kind of stepping on some ethical toes there? So just briefly towards the end, so we've talked a bit about maybe the idea of systems. I just want to talk about spaces. So if a lot of this stuff foregrounds the idea of interaction. So interactions, the idea that interaction in a kind of in a game situation is you're getting something different from just watching it. You can watch a film documentary about maybe poverty, but you're not able to interact with it. And the idea of being able to interact with it lends you it communicates something different. It gives you maybe a sense of empathy for either the kind of troubles within the system or an individual account. Another thing then, you can represent the systems, but you can also maybe represent spaces. So I want to talk briefly about virtual reality. Now, virtual reality, the kind of overlap with gaming, I mean, a lot of people might say virtual reality isn't a game, but it uses a lot of the same mechanics. I mean, virtual reality is basically a kind of mesh between the languages of film and gaming and theatre. So this is an example that the BBC made, which is a virtual reality version of the 1916 Easter Uprising in Ireland. And you're able to, basically shown a series of vignettes in which you're able to kind of move around and look around. You listen to a kind of audio account. Now, I guess it's technically not a game in the sense that you're not dealing with a you're not dealing with a kind of managing maybe the social and political systems. Like if this was maybe more explicitly a game, it'd be made into, you know, like Cart Life or Spent, where you've got like a series of, you know, it kind of reduces the political situation into a series of kind of charts that you have to kind of manage and deal with, you know, like an Excel spreadsheet simulator. Here you're actually put into the space, so the emphasis is on kind of immersion within the space instead of the system, if that makes any sense. And again, the interaction comes from the choice of being able to look around. Another example maybe here would be The Guardian did a good piece called 6 by 9, where you're put into solitary confinement in the US. And again, it might not technically be a game in that there isn't much in the way of gameplay, but you're able to look around and interact. And the emphasis, much like a lot of the games that look at kind of news and kind of political and social event, is on immersion. It's on kind of immersing you within the actual situation. Here it's an immersion within a cell, but in the other examples it might be immersion within the kind of system of poverty in the US. One other example here is Noni de Le Pen's Project Syria, where you're put in a kind of market, and again you're able to look around and everything, and then a bomb blast happens. And this one's a bit more interesting because it has a bit more of a kind of explicit overlap with documentary, in that all of the kind of sound that comes from it is actually recorded from a real world explosion, but it's obviously a virtual environment that you're put within. Another one here is this is Notes on Blindness, which is excellent if you ever get a chance to play it or experience it or watch it or whatever verb you use, where you inhabit the kind of perspective of a man who's turning blind, and it's trying to communicate that personal account to you. Sorry, 2 more and then I'll shut up. So this is a great piece by the National Theatre. I've made this. It's called Home Amir, and this is set within the jungle camp in Calais. So putting this in the kind of games context might be massively wrong, because it's obviously it's made with 360 film. So these guys went into the jungle camp and moved around, you know, with this massive camera that does 360 film, and then when you put the virtual reality headset on, you're there. You're able to choose where to look around. So it's not a game in the traditional sense, but that element of immersion and choice is still very much present. One more that I want to... So I think that piece really succeeds. One piece I think that really fails is another piece by the BBC called We Wait, where you're put in you're put in a boat kind of crossing the Mediterranean, and it immerses you within that kind of crossing, and you're placed within those, you know, the same situation as those characters. But I'd say this is a kind of really interesting aesthetic choice, whereas the last one has that kind of rawness that comes from real actual film. This looks a lot more like a game. So it looks a lot more animated. It looks a bit less like reality. So kind of going back to this idea of having the camera and the eye of a camera, whether games can ever be that. Like, can a game ever be documentary if it doesn't have a camera, if it isn't an actual lens looking at reality? So the reason I think this fails is more just, I think, because of the rawness of this at the moment, distancing it aesthetically by choosing to kind of have it as an animation, I felt didn't work. It kind of makes it slightly cutesy. That's just my personal opinion. But one I kind of want to put within this context, which has a very similar aesthetic choice, is That Dragon Cancer. Now, this could, I think, very well much be a virtual reality experience as much as a game. Like, for a large portion of it, you're placed within situations and you're looking around. I'd say this really succeeds, though, because it chooses to kind of have a much more impressionistic perspective of the events. It kind of plays to this fact of it kind of leans in towards that abstract use of animation rather than just making it cutesy. It's actually really hard hitting. So that's good. Kind of going back maybe just to this vague idea of like whether games can ever be documentaries. I guess they probably can't. because documentary is very much a film medium, but it's interesting to see whether it's looking at more of a journalistic perspective or kind of looking at just more openly looking at the systems, like the political and social systems around social events, or immersing you within a scene, like a specific scene. It's interesting to see people working with games and virtual reality actually targeting real world problems and situations. So I just maybe leave it with this quote. So reality changes in order to represent it, modes of representation must change. So I feel like games and virtual reality, or the overlap between the two, can really have an important, they can hit a lot of the same marks that documentary filmmakers do, but ultimately you're doing it in a very different way. Whether that's looking at the actual systems behind a lot of the thing, immersing you within that, or immersing you within the scenes. But yeah, so I think games can be documentary, but they shouldn't be called documentary. Anyway, sorry, there's some thoughts. Okay.